But Jane, thank you so much for coming on the Female Body Politic again. I'm so thrilled to have you. For everybody who's listening, Jane Ruby is the president of the League of Women Voters Chicago, which is the largest league of women voters in the country and certainly the most active. But Jane, you have a new title. What's your new title that I'm so excited for you to share?
I am officially a UN observer on behalf of League of Women Voters of US. I couldn't be more grateful for that opportunity in addition to my work in Chicago, in Illinois, with our local league chapters that way. A lot of people don't know that the League of Women Voters actually was one of the main organizations that really pushed for the U.S. to join the United Nations Charter. And so our organization has had special observer status in the Economic and Social Council body of the UN since its founding.
And right, so you're at the UN right now for the
hmm
Commission on the Status of Women, which is an incredibly important global gathering of, governmental and non-governmental women at the UN. And so, Jane, can you just tell everybody a little bit about what the Commission on the Status of Women is and like what everybody's doing there?
Yeah, so this is actually its 70th year, sort of hosting a annual gender equality conference. And so different member states, across the world send representatives, have their ambassadors, sit in on convening meetings, and out of it, the member states sort of arrive at conclusions about sort of path forward on gender equality. So it's pretty sort of revolutionary and incredible that the UN has been prioritizing gender equality for as long as it has. And so not only do member states get to sort of participate in being here, but also NGOs, civil society organizations, academics, organizers, elected officials, and the like. So this is my third year being here for a CSW conference, and quite quite surreal with just kind of the state of the world every time. It's a very interesting space to
Yeah.
be an American. And so, there's a lot of responsibility as Americans when we're in these spaces to, show a different side to America and, civil society.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into what's going on there with sort of the American delegate in a minute. But I just want to talk to you about like the importance of, right, you are building literally, like you as an individual are building diplomatic relationships with women all across the globe. And like in a moment, right, where American diplomacy is just disintegrating, like a James Bond villain being melted or whatever. You are there building these ties. And can you talk about what it's like, what the conversations are like, how it feels? Like, I mean, that's a lot of weight for you to bear, but also it must be a lot of inspiration for you to have. So how are you holding up? What are you doing?
Yeah, my first time walking into the United Nations, like, I felt like if anyone's seen, The Rescuers, the Disney movie from the '70s, about, like, the mice that, rescue people. Well, it's based at the United Nations, so when I first walked in, I was like, "Oh my gosh," like, I feel like the rescuers, like, what sort of a incredibly historic legacy that, has continued to be a source of peace and, fight for justice and equality in a global sense. And, so, to be in these spaces alone is just such a huge privilege. Having served before and have been present at past CSWs, I already sort of knew that the kind of morale and expectation around US participation was already, you know, quite low. But I think, um, you know, seasoned people who, come here, even other member states have sort of understood for a long time the US's role in these spaces and the void that the US often takes in spaces around human rights, around gender equality, around climate. And that has just been historic through the years, a de-emphasis or deprioritization on behalf of the U.S. State Department, the U.S. government in, human rights as a whole. And so, the role and responsibility of Americans and organizations in these spaces, like, there really is a big void to fill on behalf of our government because it isn't, what you see on the news about how the US reacts in, diplomatic situations isn't telling the full picture about the power and potency of the American people
Yeah.
to, paint a different picture of, what life is like, what we're all fighting for, what the future looks like.
Well, and also the power that we can bring to bear, right, as individuals working in community. And I just want to touch back on what you said at the beginning of this. Like, it was League of Women Voters who pressured the United States to join the UN in the first place. And imagine a world without the League of Women's voice in getting the US to join the United Nations. Like, for as many problems as we have now, I think we can all agree that having diplomatic conversations and relationships with a global community at least opens the path of possibility to peace and justice and equality. And without the League of Women Voters, right, that wouldn't have happened. And I'm always just so interested and awed by, you know, folks like you who are taking steps not only locally, not only nationally, but internationally to rebuild these networks of diplomacy and community and solidarity. And like, can you talk a little bit about, what you personally are doing there? Like, are you observing? Are you on committees? Like, what's your role?
Yeah, so I'm here as an observer. Our organization every year hosts a sort of a webinar hybrid option. So we work with other organizations and we sponsor it on different topics. The one this year was around building sort of an kind of like the international sort of criminal court. They're trying to launch something to build out an international anti-corruption court,
Oh,
which would kind
interesting.
of correct. So, we were one of the sponsor organizations to sort of talk about what that process looks like in a global sense. So, that's where it's sort of like think globally, act locally, like, everything kind of comes full circle in these spaces. But
Yeah.
there's lots of opportunities, not only to sort of be an observer and listen to other people's lived experiences and hear what's going on in the world, which is something that, I'm always just deeply fascinated in, but also, to really sort of interact with people, from other countries. And like one of my favorite stories actually from last year was I was at an event that the Irish mission to the UN had hosted at their offices. And afterward, I, wanted to introduce myself to the Irish ambassador. And I wanted to talk about Irish politics because, they have ranked choice voting. They've elected three female presidents, like doing awesome stuff in Ireland.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Tell me about the Save Act." He
Yeah.
he saw my like League of Women Voters button and was
Oh,
like, I want to know what's going on with this. And it's interesting because, now with the Save Act coming up for discussion in the Senate right now, it's really, it's like, in a year's time, we're still having these sorts of conversations. And I think it's also something, to really pay attention to is that globally, people are really looking to see what's happening here
yeah.
and, incredibly concerned because of how interconnected everything is. We're not the only country that's rolling back gender rights, that's, really sort of, descending this pathway into fascism and authoritarianism with a deliberate focus on rolling back women's rights, rolling back, human rights stuff. And so, we all have to sort of be, thinking about that, as we sort of plot and plan next steps and, how we're going to really tackle this.
Yeah, and let's talk about that because, and you can correct my terminology, but the U.S. delegate to the Commission on the Status of Women, Dan Negria, just tell everybody tell everybody what the deal. You'll say it better than I did. What
Mhm.
happened? What
Yeah,
happened
so
this week?
so the as with, there's multiple, category commissions and, special projects where the UN publishes findings and, governing docs on, stuff happening now and stuff we can work towards for the future. And so every year there's sort of a gender equity um document that is produced about sort of, tips and tricks and paths forward, and something that all of the member states can sort of use as a resource moving forward. And this was the first time in the 70-year history of this commission that there wasn't sort of consensus on the document. And the one vote against it actually came from the United States. And a lot of, I mean, I'm sure you can guess all of the reasons why that happened, but it had to do with the language around gender, the language around equality, the language around DEI were all of the reasons that the U.S. Opted to vote against the document.
Right. And so not only, I mean, talking about, this international community that we're all in and how our individual actions affect that international community, it's just so atrocious that, the US delegate is actively standing in the way and saying that the US, right, as a government is opposed to gender equality. In not only in the US but in the world. And like you said, it is a, permission for other increasingly authoritarian governments to follow suit. And as we all know, right, when women's rights and women's capacity to speak truth to power and to have a voice in their government is curtailed, that's when the dominoes really start to fall in terms of burgeoning fascism. I mean, that's always the first um, step or one of the first steps. But yeah, so that's just truly both shocking and not at all surprising. But what was I mean, I'm just so curious, what was the reaction in the room when that happened? Did people groan, or was it just sort of like, of course he did?
Yeah, I think that as the this rollback around gender equality didn't happen overnight. This is sort of a conscientious and strategic, targeted, long-term goal that, has been going on for some time. So I don't think anyone was terribly surprised. It's just more of a disappointment
Mhm.
that once again we have these systems in place to promote kind of global unity, global equality, global peace, and when important and powerful people decide to sort of vote against collective interest and collective liberation, it just is sort of another way to kind of stall progress and everything we're pushing for, but it really sort of makes the kind of civil society level, all of us, even more committed to not only sort of ensuring that the optics around gender equality, we're not all just giving up, and that
Yeah.
we really are part of the resistance, but also that you know ensuring that organizations like the United Nations are able to continue to do the work that is so important. Um, a lot of people, the only exposure to the UN kind of comes from watching something on the news where it's like, the Security Council vetoed this, or there was something going on in the Security Council, and I'm like, that's a huge part of sort of how the member states interact with each other is in these sort of diplomatic ways. But I really think that the power and potency of the United Nations is really on the civil society component
Hmm.
and the amount of information and accessibility for people at the grassroots level to engage with content and people and systems and resources in the United Nations, framework is really where all the work gets done, and really where, the power in thinking about what a, global, peaceful, very, Federation of Planets, Star Trek, you know, dynamic really could look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I know that a lot of the work in CSW is really about forming these networks and creating these relationships. But you mentioned, right, what's the impact on civil society? what are you seeing coming out? I know it's not over, but like what's coming out of the CSW in terms of women's rights and on the ground impact? Like, how are people kind of forming ideas and plans and goals and strategies around this idea, right? Because this year they're focused on equality and making sure that women have access to, right, these justice systems. Like, how is that
Yeah.
kind of manifesting in a real way through these conversations?
Oh, I mean, I think, like, the brutal honesty that is coming out, it's like people don't come here and, like, sugarcoat the truth. Like, you are
Mm,
sitting in rooms with, you know, uh, people who are who are talking about what's really happening in the world, whether it's human trafficking, gender-based violence, um, you know, uh all of the things that, are directly impacting women in a global sense, like, you come here and you're hearing stories, from people who are experiencing it firsthand, from people who are really in the trenches fighting, against this while, wars are happening, while there's, famines and genocide and, all kinds of, especially environmental
mm,
situations. And they're still coming here to talk about the power of gender equality and really being such a dominating factor in a path forward of what we all need to be sort of keeping in mind as we're fighting our own individual battles, fighting our you know country battles, whatever it is. It's all still needs to be in a framework of what equality looks like, what peace looks like.
yeah, I mean, because we all know by now that women's equality is foundational to everything else we want, right? We want peace, we want food, we want healthcare, we want education, whatever it is, we want prosperity. All of that begins with women's equality, which is not surprising because they're 50%, right? It's a matter of math. They're 50% of the population or 51% in the United States. If they don't have equality, then the rest of everyone else will be brought down. And I think my internet is a little jittery because I look like I'm in a
Mhm.
music video right now. But yeah, and it's just it's amazing, not amazing, but it's just horrifying how much it is under attack right now everywhere. And I think what's really shocking is that, right, we have this idea in the United States that while it's been hard fought, right, women's progress is a forward is a perpetual forward motion. But now we're seeing, as you mentioned before, the Save Act, rollback in women's reproductive care, that we're really backsliding and in a way that's affecting women on the ground today. And yeah, and is that like how is that hitting there? Like, are people talking about that or, you
Oh,
know
yeah, I mean, the movement around sort of, anti-gender sentiment, it really sort of starts with education and language, as we look at sort of the history of authoritarianism. A lot of it comes down to first they go after education and education systems. And, one of the reasons why the US voted down, the document at this commission was, the language terms that are being used. It's like it's once again going after DEI and gender, and you can't use these phrasings. But it's like, if we don't use those phrasings, how else are we going to move past, you know,
Right.
needing them to, ensure that there is equality and fair treatment in our systems. So, really kind of one of the big things is just like, fighting back on the education front, ensuring that people understand what's really at stake. Like if you look at, and I mean, I know you've been in the trenches too around Save Act stuff, but the misinformation where it's like, "Oh, it's not a big deal to show an ID at a polling place," and it's like, "Well, no, actually, like, it is a big deal," and it's sort of like, they're the sort of authoritarian side has done, quite a good job of sort of figuring out a unified message and
Mhm.
pushing that forth and, depriving people of education and economic systems that would allow them to make better decisions about the stuff that that people are supporting. And, that directly plays into, why people aren't getting out coming out and voting, why, you know, uh, particular people get elected or parties get elected, and, it's that everything is interconnected.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the SAVE Act, I think, I wasn't the only one to say it, but it's, the Show Me Your Papers Act, right? Like, it's so classically fascistic that it just recalls this like classic Nazi phrase of "Show me your papers." And it's in the Senate right now. Looks like it's not gonna pass, and it's not gonna. The Republicans aren't gonna nuke the filibuster to get it passed, which is good. But also, like, we can never forget. Um, I've seen in the Trump regime's behavior this time and last time. I can only uh, uh, relate it to the velociraptors in the first Jurassic Park, where they're like testing the fence
Mhm.
for weaknesses. Like, that's what they do. They're very good at testing the fence for weaknesses and then retreating and then finding where they can push forward. So it's not like this is over. Just because it's defeated this time doesn't mean it's over. And we look at, right, the rollback of women's capacity to voice their opinions across the world. I mean, is that like, what are people saying about that in terms of, right, these other nations that don't have the infrastructure that the United States does? How are women's voices in government being impacted there?
Yeah, I love your velociraptor, terminology because I've definitely used that as well. Yeah, boy mom life.
Yeah, boy, mom.
But, that's really what it's about. The SAVE Act will probably not pass, but the amount of people who are now questioning whether our voter registration laws are valid, and, who's voting and who's not voting, or, the, federal attack on vote by mail, saying that it's not safe when it's proven to be a safe method. The amount of people where it then peop everyday Americans are like, "Oh, are these things okay? Are these things okay to use? Is voting safe? Should I vote?" All of this is really kind of the authoritarian, regime winning in sort of public opinion, and, that is something that, we know is true because historically that's always how it's been, and, to really sort of lessen people coming out and participating, whether it's by voting, whether it's by, questioning what their kids are being taught in schools, questioning economic fairness. That is a huge thing of, it's not fair that women get paid less than men, but not enough people are questioning that, and they just are like, "Well, this is the system, and they've told us that this is the way it works, so we're just gonna be okay. We have to, be okay with it." We really shouldn't be okay with it. Men and women shouldn't be okay with it. And, I think that there's a lot of countries that sort of, have placed gender equality, have placed peace in a sort of high, kind of precious box that is, there, and something untouchable, and something that, governs how they think about stuff, within their own countries, within, how they interact in diplomatic senses. And that's often everyone is always like, I feel like in my network, everyone's always like, well, they do these cool things in Scandinavia. Why can't we have them? And it's like, well, those countries are also sort of newer democracies,
Mm.
newer frameworks where they were able to be forward thinking about how they included women in the process, how, what that looks like, what equality looks like, what peace looks like, is very different than our democracy, which is the oldest of the modern democracies. And 250 years ago, it looked very different.
Mhm. Yeah.
How we set stuff up. And, I often talk about how the democracy that our country was founded on was very limiting, and we've just been fighting for inclusivity, fighting for making it more expansive and just ever since. in ways that other countries haven't had to do that. And, so I think that it kind of does a disservice to the movement to sort of compare and contrast, because I
Mm.
think every country, has different frameworks for how they address it. But I do think it is very inspirational and aspirational to be able to look and see how other countries are modeling equality and have those conversations, bring those ideas back to the work that we do at the local and grassroots level, and really build up those systems that, we can really work towards at the, national level.
Right, but I think that's such a great point, Jane. I think I only have you for a half an hour, but talking about the global is local, the local is also global, right? We look at these countries that have um, basically better systems of democracy that allow people to voice their opinion, have their opinions heard, and their needs and their wants heard in government, right? Like, how can we model those systems onto our local governments, right? Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in liberal spaces that are interested in reforming democracy. A lot of municipalities are moving toward ranked choice voting, which is always a great example. New York and this little town, Ojai, near me recently did that, and so many others. But yeah, just like building that democracy from the ground up, because you're right. The United States system was built of, for, and by white men, right? And we need to really think about how we can shift that fundamentally through the framework of the Constitution, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, really in this 250th year. And Jane, you and I have to just like geek out on this history at some point.
Yes.
But how we can have this be like the rebirth of our democracy, because right, like the powers that be have been trying to and successfully prohibiting us from growing. And what we see now, in my opinion, is really the death that is stagnation. So I love that. Before I let you go, though, I know you just had the Chicago. You're from Chicago. The
Mhm.
Illinois primaries were just concluded yesterday on St. Patrick's Day. I wanted to get your like feeling. How did you think they shook out? Are you feeling positive about the candidates that won, or a little mixed?
Um, I think that it was definitely a win for women. There were many, many, well, we had a very unprecedented open primaries in quite quite a lot of races, both at the federal all the way down to local level. So we had an unprecedented number of candidates running for these spots, and a lot of really incredibly qualified people. I think above all, it was a win for women. Many very strong, incredible women won. And I think, as you and I can both agree on, when women lead, peace follows.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely something, it's important to sort of build out gender parity in our government. I am disappointed in low voter turnout. I think also having so many open seats and so many candidates running for these seats also caused a lot of uh, stress among voters
Mm.
about choice. If we had ranked choice voting, I think that there would have been, more fair outcomes in some of these races. And so hopefully the movement around ranked choice voting in Illinois grows significantly as a result of this primary um, season. But, voter turnout was still pretty low, and that is something that we just constantly need to be mindful of and constantly need to be working towards, in all aspects of everything that we do.
I know, because what is it, like 7% of the population votes in Republican primaries? So like a million people are determining world policy. Like, what that's where we all like to a large degree, right? If you're like, oh, how can I change things? If you get 10 people to vote in your primary, you it's like extraordinary return on your investment.
Mhm.
Insane. And it's just, I love that you brought that up, Jane, and because the changes that we want to implement seem so huge, but when we look at the people who are causing all this mayhem, it's such a small number. And it drives, and this is like, I'm somewhat off topic, but it drives me crazy. We're like, oh, we got to get the MAGA base. We got to get the MAGA base. No, We need to get we need to convince the people who don't vote that change is possible, and voting can bring about that change. And I think that's why the voter turnout, when you have ranked choice voting and you have progressive candidates, the voter turnout is astronomical. In addition, right, to the incredible grassroots organizing that so many people are doing, such as
Yeah.
yourself, James, such as yourself. It is always such an honor and a privilege to get on these with you, Jane. And thank you so much for your work at the Commission of the Status of Women. I am so grateful for you there and all your advocacy locally, globally, and nationally. You're so amazing.
Thanks so much for having me, and, greetings from the United Nations. Uh,
Yes. And it looks like
it
a
is
lovely day in New York.
it's cold, but at least it's sunny. We've had some pretty, unexpected weather here and across the state, so I will take a sunny day above all. But, thank you so much for having me to kind of come and talk about this, and, I hope it's a, great way to activate some people, on this call or listening to this later to, not only get involved in the UN stuff, but also, bring this work back to your local communities at the grassroots level.
Absolutely. And if you want to follow Jane, she's on Substack, and also League of Women Voters Chicago is on Substack. And y'all are doing amazing work. Just to really quickly tell everybody, if you have an extra minute, tell everybody about your what you're doing to ensure that the election is safe and fair. What's that initiative that y'all started there in Chicago?
Yeah, so there's a national hotline sort of coalition, 866 Our Vote, which is an election protection space. So, especially going into the November midterms or any sort of primaries that anyone might be having around the country between now and then, 866 Our Vote is the national election protection hotline. In conjunction with that, we have also launched a peacekeeping initiative, which is, yes, there are problems that can happen at the polls, and that's just, the normal problems that happen, obviously, with the federal government, threatening intervention in elections. There's also that level of escalation, whether it's ICE or, actually tampering with elections, that we're also paying attention to. But really, the idea of peacekeeping is um is a way to ensure that people just feel safe and comfortable at the polls. It's bringing faith leaders and social workers and other civic organizations into the space around ensuring that when people come to the polls, there's people there that, are encouraging them, are on their side, that can, ensure that people have positive experiences at the polls. Because if you have a positive experience at the poll, chances are you're going to vote again, and chances are you're going to bring other people to vote. And so those sorts of experiences really can make a huge difference in election participation.
Mm,
So this is, something we rolled out for our March primary yesterday, but it's something we're going to continue and keep working towards.
amazing. Everybody get involved. If you're worried, don't agonize, organize. Be like Jane. Well, thank you so much. I love you, and we'll see you
Yes.
soon. I'll see you soon in
Yes.
Chicago.
Bye.
Bye.